And with that great compassion and bodhicitta, to whatever extent we can cultivate it in our hearts, we can do the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Oh, nice to see folks. And so last class, towards the end, I just gave like a brief, based on the text itself, I gave a brief introduction, to kind of why we're studying this topic. But and again, I just want to remind people. So now we're using, because we're covering mind and mental factors, right? Now sem tang, semjong. So sem is mind and semjong, mental factors. So it's by Yeshe Gyaltsen. So we're using this text, which is called A Necklace for Those of Clear Awareness, clearly revealing the modes of minds and mental factors. And I think the link is in the chat. I think Venerable Damse put it there. And I actually wanted to say a couple more things by way of introduction. There's something that was kind of intriguing. I just thought to share. And this is not in that text, it's about that text, or brief quotes, but I'm actually going to quote this, which is a book by His Holiness Dalai Lama called The Life of My Teacher, a biography of Kyabje Ling Rinpoche. And so the Dalai Lama's senior tutor, his main root guru, was Ling Rinpoche. And so Ling Rinpoche was like the senior tutor to Dalai Lama. He was also the head of the Gelugpa, the holder of Lama Tsongkhapa's throne for many years. I think he was I was thinking of that, nowadays, if someone becomes the Ganden Tripa, the holder of Tsongkhapa's throne, it's for 7 years. But Ling Rinpoche, because it was during the time of exile, when the Tibetans first escaped, he held that position for a long time. And so he's viewed as kind of the main person who tutored the Dalai Lama and helped the Dalai Lama become the practitioner he is. He's also, kind of was the person who I think helped hold together this particular tradition through one of the darkest times in Tibetan history, probably the darkest time since Tsongkhapa's time. But anyway, so Ling Rinpoche was a great scholar and a great yogi and a great teacher of Buddhism. And I wanted to read, I just thought this was kind of intriguing. So this is the Dalai Lama talking about his teacher. He says, the Dalai Lama, his main palace was Potala, right, in Tibet. Oh, the book is called The Life of My Teacher. And it's a very kind of an intimate portrait of the Dalai Lama. Apparently it was actually written, well, the Dalai Lama says that. Dalai Lama is the main author, but he co-authored it really with Chungla Rato Rinpoche, who just passed away at 98 or 99, who was a dear friend of the Dalai Lama's. But anyway, I'm getting off track. So Ling Rinpoche, right? So again, Ling Rinpoche was one of the great scholars and yogis and practitioners and teachers of Tibetan Buddhism. And so the Dalai Lama, I'm going to read most of 2 paragraphs. So Dalai Lama says, whether Ling Rinpoche was staying in the Potala or the Norbulinka is the Dalai Lama's summer palace in Tibet, he always took with him the text of the short, intermediate, and extensive stages of the path, the Lamrim, by Tsongkhapa, the annotations of the stages of the path by Pabongka Rinpoche. Pabongka Rinpoche was the root guru of Ling Rinpoche, or one of the root gurus. And the other text he took with him was the presentation on minds and mental factors by Yongzhen Yeshe Gyaltsen, entitled The Ornament for Those with Intelligent Minds, Clear Teachings on Mind and Mental Factors, as well as its summary in verse called The Jewel Garland by the same author. He would study these texts regularly. So that was one point. Right, so I just thought it was intriguing to start with, right? And then I'm going to read one more quote about the same topic later in the same text. He says later in his life, still, Ling Rinpoche always had, he was a meditator and also a scholar, right? So he had always had some text with him. So he says, makes a point, although Ling Rinpoche was a great, kept his vows very purely as a monk, and knew the vows very well, he always kept a copy of Gungtang Tempe Dronme's summary of advice on the 3 vows in his box beside where he meditated, of regular recitation texts. Then he says, he also treasured Yese Gyaltsen's root text and commentary on mind and mental factors. So this is the text we're studying, you understand? Like this is the second time. So this is late in his life. He was still carrying that text around, this text. And he said, Dalai Lama says, Rinpoche held the view that examining the mind during meditation sessions and post-meditation sessions and applying the appropriate antidote to any mental affliction as soon as it arose was the most important and greatest virtuous practice. And he counseled others to do likewise. So I think that's very, I mean, I wanted to share that because like you could, one could think, oh, this is like a text on mind and mental factors. What's its relevance? Or you might wonder that, right? And so to think like this is one of the, the Dalai Lama's personal tutor, right, was keeping this text throughout his entire life, right? This was one of the few texts he always carried with him. And why, right? The Dalai Lama answers why, right? Because real Dharma practice is watching your own mind, right? And knowing when mental afflictions arise, right? When virtuous states of mind arise, how do you cultivate those virtuous, positive minds, and how do you overcome the mental afflictions? And in one way, I think it's intriguing just to contemplate, right? Like Ling Rinpoche, these teachings are derived from Abhidharma, right? And Ling Rinpoche was a great master of Abhidharma who studied the Abhidharma Kosha and the Abhidharma Samkhya and all these. But what he kept with him was this text, right? This is one he carried around for practice, right? And so I just want to point out, like, this is a practice text. Does that make sense? Like, this is a text for actual Dharma practice. And, I don't want to, I want to emphasize it at the beginning. I said this a little bit last class, but I want to say it again in a different way using Ling Rinpoche to now quote these quotes about Ling Rinpoche to say, like, this teaching on mind and mental factors is like essential practice advice. And even if you've studied, say, Lojong, I was thinking about this as I read that yesterday. Like, there are many teachings in Lojong, right? There's one in the 8 verses of mind training, Lojong's mind training, right? That says, the moment a mental affliction arises, I will notice it, confront it, and avert it. Right? But actually, in order to do that, right, that's and Ling Rinpoche and the Dalai Lama are saying that's the essence of Dharma practice. But in order to do that, you have to know what is a mental affliction, right? And otherwise, how do you know that it arose, and how do you confront it? And that may seem silly in one way, right, to say, oh, what is a mental affliction? But first of all, if you don't know, I actually just want to share that. Like, this happens often, is that people get confused, actually, right? Like, people confuse. I was just talking to somebody the other day where it was like this came up. What is anger? Okay. And where's the line where something is a mental affliction, anger or hatred, and where's the line where it's not? Well, you have to study mind and mental factors to know that, right? You have to know, and then you have to introspect, look in your own mind using the definitions they give to check, where am I at? The same thing, like, people often ask, what's the difference between like love and attachment? Right? Do you love somebody or are you grasping at them? Well, if you study mind and mental factors, you know the difference. Does that make sense? If you don't, you don't. So my point is like, so we don't know how to avert the mental afflictions. We get confused, and oftentimes, like, people say that, right? Oh, am I setting an appropriate boundary, or am I being angry and mean? It's not an external question. It's a question for the mind, right? It's a question about your own mind. So it's mind and mental facts. So, I think Ling Rinpoche was, knew this topic. I'm sure he memorized these definitions and knew them quite well, but I think his carrying that around was also a teaching, or was setting an example of how you practice, right? That you take these teachings. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, that you take these teachings on mind and mental factors and you apply them. First of all, you apply them by introspecting, by looking inside your own experience in your own mind and getting to know your mind, if that makes sense, right? So, like, this is like, I would almost call this text, like, actually, one way I was thinking of it is you could almost call this text a field guide to your mind, like so that when you're, this is interesting, like a field guide and a tome, right? This is like, it's small enough that you can carry it with you in your, like Ling Rinpoche did, right? So the idea is like that when you're actually practicing, you would refer back, right? And go, oh, wait, what's going on in my mind? And if you're not sure, you would look up, like check with your mind, then you would look at, these teachings on the mind. And the goal is to understand yourself, right? To understand your own mind better. And I'm not going to review, last time by way of introduction, there was like an introductory section, where like most Tibetan texts have verses of homage and so on. And I'm not going to go over all of that again. It's on the YouTube recording, but I just want to emphasize, right, like a couple quotes. So the author in the beginning says, he quotes on page 7, Chandrakirti, he says, the very diverse worlds of sentient beings and their environments are established by the mind itself. It is taught that all migrating beings without exception are born from karma, from their actions, right? And actions come from the mind. Actually, what part of the mind, how do actions come from the mind? Well, if we study this text, we'll know, right? It's intention, right? From intention comes karma, right? Intention is karma in essence. So we have to study this text to know that, right? And then he points out, he quotes Shantideva, those who do not understand this secret of the mind, the great objective of the Dharma, wander aimlessly, even though they wish to attain happiness and destroy suffering. Therefore, I should hold well and guard well this mind of mine, right? So all the essential, and we know this, right? Like, so, but I guess I just want to emphasize this point again that, this, like, and Yeshe Gelsen points this out, so I'm pointing out first. So if you want to practice mind training, Lojong, right? The first one, right? It's like, if you want to train your mind, you have to understand your mind. Right? So this is essential. This kind of study is really helpful if you want to practice mind training. And the author actually says, if you want to practice Lamrim, right, then again, you have to understand the mind, right? Because the cause, if you understand like the, again, for the low scope, it's karma, right, that we're trying to take care of. But karma is led by the mind, right? Karma is produced by our mind, actually, primarily. Then also, if you understand the middle scope of Lamrim, right, which is the cause of suffering, right, the Four Noble Truths. So it's like, what's the nature of suffering? What's the cause of suffering? What's the path to eliminate that suffering? The cause of suffering is in your mind. The path to eliminate suffering is in your mind, right? And then even the Mahayana, right, cultivating bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a state of is a mind, actually, it's a main mind. Now we can say, actually usually we say, bodhicitta, cultivate bodhicitta, right? But actually we can get it, once you study this text, you can actually ask, what is bodhicitta? Is it a mental factor? Is it a mind? Is it a main mind? What is it? We'll analyze that at some point as we go along. My point though is like, so if you want to practice mind training or Lamrim or Tantra, you have to, what Yeshe Gelsen and Ling Rinpoche and the Dalai Lama are pointing out is, studying this topic, mind and mental factors, is extremely helpful. And otherwise, we tend to get things wrong, and we often do. I've seen that in myself and friends, where like, if you're trying to practice, but if you don't really know what are the mental factors, then we get it wrong. We get confused about how to practice. So this text is a very practice-oriented text. Yeah, and the last part of what we covered last time, yes, I'll just cover that one last time. So Yeshe Gelsen, this is on page 9, this is where kind of we left off, is he says, he basically says again and again in the Sutras and Tantras, as well as in the commentaries, it has been taught that all the excellent qualities of the paths and grounds of the 3 vehicles and the resultant Buddha field, the bodies and lifespan and deeds of a Buddha, all arise from the mind. So he says, so if you want to achieve Buddhahood, you have to understand the mind, right? So he's saying even Buddhahood itself comes from the mind, right? So anyway, so whether we want to avoid, suffering, or we want to benefit others, or we want to benefit ourselves, or we want to become, free from suffering, or we become fully enlightened, for any of those things, we have to understand the mind. So that's the purpose of studying this text, actually. And I think that's just fascinating. I mean, for me, that was quite interesting, though, to think that Ling Rinpoche, throughout his entire life, one of the greatest scholars of ever, certainly the greatest scholars of the 20th century, carried this text around with him throughout his entire life. Somehow I look at the text and think, wow, what was he, can actually reflect on what was he referring back to over and over? We can ask ourselves that as we go along. But anyway, that's all introduction, right? And now we'll actually start the text. And so, I mean, that was the text in part, but now we start the actual topic. And so we pick up at the bottom of page 9. So he says, hence it is of the utmost importance to understand the modes of minds and mental factors. Thus, I shall here compose a brief presentation on minds and mental factors that has 2 parts. One thing that's kind of interesting is he says a brief presentation, right? So he's implying you could, this is, you can say, wow, there's more to this, but he's going to focus on a practical level. So he says, this has 2 parts: the individual entities and the divisions of mind and mental factors, and a summary of salient points and their application to practice. Then he says the individual entities of minds and mental factors, an explanation of minds and an explanation of mental factors. Right. So this is actually, by the way, that what is that? That is Tibetan texts. Many or most Tibetan texts have outlines. They're amazing outline. Tibetan authors tend to be amazing outline producers. If you sometimes, I don't have one here. Sometimes each of them handy, but sometimes in the backs of translations of books, they'll have like a whole section that's just the outline, and it's like 1A, C, 1, 2, 4B, it's like it goes on and on, all the subheadings, and that's Tibetan system of outline text. And you'll see sometimes if the original author didn't do an outline, some later scholar will sometimes do an outline to the text so that it's easier to look at in that way. So here I assume that it's Yeshe Gelton's own outline. There was no indication that anybody added, so I see it looks like he had created his own outline. But so he starts, so we're going to start. So what he's saying, though, right, is that basically there are 2, right? We said mind and mental factors. So we're going to start with an explanation of mind and then mental factors. And I won't say more because he's going to say it, so I'll follow him in presenting and explaining. But we could say explain main mind minds. You could say, and I want to. So there. Here it says an explanation of minds, and then he says regarding the difference between a mind and a mental factor. So I want to pause there to say mind, right? A mind. So what he's getting at is sometimes there are different translations, and you'll see them as we go along. But some people call it main mind, or primary mind, or basic mind. Those are different translations of that. But, and to differentiate that from the mental factors, right? So there's like the main mind or the primary mind or the basic mind. And then there are mental factors that accompany it. That's just clarifying the terms here. And he's going to actually, and I want to point something out, is he's going to give 2 different definitions of a main mind. You'll see that as we go along. They're both correct. And we'll get into why he gives two different definitions. But he says, regarding the difference between a mind and a mental factor, Maitreya's discriminating the middle and the extremes, the Majanta Vibhaga, which is one of the 5 treatises of Maitreya that are studied in Tibet. So he quotes Maitreya, and he says, that which sees an object is a primary consciousness, or a main mind, right? That which sees its attribute is a mental factor. So that's one definition. Actually, he gives 3 definitions. I'm sorry. Then he gives another definition from Vasubandhu's Abhidharma, Treasury of Knowledge. Primary consciousness knows individually. And I'll pause there and say a few things. Like, so this first definition, that which sees an object is a primary consciousness, right? Or a primary consciousness knows individually. What they actually say in the tradition is that this is the definition for meditators. Later, we're going to have a definition that's mainly for debaters, and they're both useful. And what they say is this definition for meditators is one that's experiential and is useful when introspecting. But apparently, I'm no expert in this, but apparently it's harder to sustain this one if you're out and debating with other scholars. Then the later definition might be more useful in debate, in the context of debate, but in the context of practice, this definition is quite useful. So, so the definition from meditators, right? That which sees an object is a primary consciousness. That which sees its attributes is a mental factor. And I'll read a little more here. It says, just as it has been said above, that which knows the mere entity of an object is called a mind. That which, taking the observation of that very object as its basis, engages the object by means of the isolates of other attributes, such as its function, is called a mental factor. I'll just keep going for a moment here, and then we'll come back. It is just as has been said by the omniscient Gyaltsab. So Gyaltsab Je is one of the two closest disciples of Je Tsongkhapa. Gyaltsab Je was after Tsongkhapa passed, Gyaltsab Je was the next person to hold Tsongkhapa's the throne of Ganden, his seat. It says, so now he's quoting Gyaltsab Je. He says, a main mind, such as the sense consciousness apprehending form, is explained to know individually its object. Just so, a main mind does not depend upon an ascertaining consciousness, being produced. Rather, it is distinguished by merely observing form. One should know that mental factors in its retinue, by way of each of their various functions, such as having taken the object, the observation of form as the basis, moving the mind towards it, each of their various attributes, such as non-forgetfulness of an object that has been previously realized. Therefore, the main mind is a knower distinguished by mere observation of the object itself and does not need to be posited in terms of other attributes. A mental factor is a knower that takes the observation of that very object as its basis and engages the object by means of the isolates of other attributes, such as the outcome of its functions, of its function rather. Okay, probably it's hard to understand these at first hearing, right? So we can go over this. So one point I want to make, which he's going to go into in more detail here in a few minutes, is that and he says it here that well, actually he says it in the next thing, but I'll just address it first. Mind and mental factors are not two separate things. In other words, they're not separate entities. That's the technical way of putting that. And what does that mean? So they're not, and actually we sometimes say it, I'm going to say it in the technical way. They're not separate entities, but they're different isolates. What does that mean? Right? You can ask. And I think actually it's an important topic, so let's pause just for a moment, right? Because like, if I were to say, Lisa and Lynn, right? Those are two separate entities, right? They're two separate people. Make sense? Whereas if I were to say, I'll use an example. If I were to say Lisa and female, right? Those are one entity, right? They're the same person, but they're conceptual. Isolate means a different, you can conceptually isolate them, right? You can say, you know, Lisa's a person, she's also a female, you know, and then I could say, wears glasses or has long hair or has a good sense of humor, whatever, you know, you could go through different attributes, and that's what he's getting at, attributes, right? So we could say that one entity has various attributes to it, right? But they're not separate entities. You can't say Lisa's sense of humor exists apart from Lisa, right? It's of one entity with Lisa. And so that's what's, so, you know, there are sometimes objects that are separate entities, right? They're two different separate phenomena. There are other times where things are one entity, but they're different isolates, meaning that they're different attributes that can be conceptually isolated, but aren't a separate thing, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So mind and mental factors are like that. Does that make sense? They're one entity, but you can conceptually isolate them because they're different attributes of a mind. You know, the mental factors yeah, are different attributes of that mind. Lynn, come on, your question.
I'm having trouble leaving what we learned before, learning how we think, or conceptualizing or understanding how we think about things. And this seems, for me, counter to what we were doing before. And in particular, what you just mentioned is, okay, you see an object and the object has attributes, but that's totally contrary to what we learned, that the attributes of an object are not the object. Everything is empty. And it sort of runs against everything we've been studying before. So I'm having a hard time holding those two things at the same time.
Say more about how it seems contradictory. Just say a little more about that. Say, because I want to make sure I can get it.
Well, we sort of worked really hard to understand or to think or to experience emptiness. And part of that is the attributes of an object are not the object. And that's sort of on the path to seeing things as, or understanding or feeling things as empty. And here it's sort of the other side of that. It's like saying there's an object and there's attributes of the objects, and I'm getting stuck between the two.
Which is an important point, I think. So like, let's stay with this for a moment, because I think you're getting at something important. So let's, because I want to say a few things. One is, like, for if we say with I mean, even within emptiness, right? We went over this. I mean, in other classes, there are different tenet systems, and they have different views. One thing that's interesting about Jung's and Yeshe Gelsen's text, he says very clearly that he's going to cover mind and mental factors in a way that's common to different tenet systems. So in other words, he's not going to present it in a way that, so there are certain unique attributes about mind and mental factors to certain, like there are certain tenet systems that have unique perspectives or, unique details that they present. He's going to present mind and mental factors in a way that's common to all the, to most of or all of the tenet systems. That's one point. So he's not, so what he's going to, my point being, what he's going to present here is not contradictory to the teachings on emptiness, is what he would say. And one thing that's kind of intriguing though, what you're getting about this idea of characteristics, right? From a Majjhimaka perspective for a moment now, I'll say, for a conventional mind that we sometimes call, right, that knows, that sees the conventional truth, right? Or sometimes they call it a truth for a concealer, because that conventional truths for ordinary people conceal something deeper, which is the emptiness of an object. So, but for a conventional mind, according to Majjhimakas even, from the perspective of that conventional mind, objects do have characteristics. So they would say, so like in other words, even a Majjhimaka wouldn't say fire isn't hot or water isn't wet or that, and so on. What they would say is that there are no intrinsic characteristics, right? Or no inherently existent characteristics. And also one could say that we sometimes say emptiness is the nature of things. We could also say emptiness is a characteristic of things in a way. It's the ultimate character. It's the ultimate characteristic of things. So from an ultimate perspective, there are no intrinsically existent characteristics. But what this is getting at is conventionally. So from the mind of a convention, the mind that sees conventional truths, there are conventionally existent characteristics. And so we're saying, so what aspect of the mind sees those? Because in other words, it's an experience, right? So in other words, when we're in that, which is true, like when you're working or eating or driving or talking to a friend or something, all those times, right? I mean, other times too, that you're in a mind you're seeing things from the perspective of conventional truth. And so what this is getting at is in those moments when you're seeing things from a perspective of conventional truth, you're seeing characteristics. So what aspect of your mind is seeing that? How is your mind seeing that? And that doesn't contradict that those characteristics only exist on a conventional level, right? I'll use one more thing just to get at your point. I'll use one more point, right? Like conventionally, if we're not looking for an ultimate, a conventional mind doesn't ask I've said this before, Chandrakirti says in his teachings on emptiness, a conventional mind doesn't analyze ultimately, right? So if I use the example, I said Lisa is a female, for example, right? So, and that was a conventional truth statement, right? That's not asking an ultimate question. It's just saying conventionally, that's a conventional truth. There's a famous passage in the Vilamakirti Sutra where Shariputra meets Bodhisattva goddess, and he says something kind of sexist, and she starts to kind of tease him, I guess you could say. But she makes one point. She says something like, for 12 years, I've been searching for femaleness and haven't yet found it. Have you found it? Now she's getting into, so what she does at that point is she asks an ultimate truth question, right? He's being kind of sexist in a conventional truth context. And then she asks an ultimate truth question. Have you been able to find some ultimately existent femaleness? Then that becomes impossible, right? So, and what I think it's getting at, I'm trying to point out, this is getting at exactly what you were raising though. Like, so in a conventional truth way, when one is looking from a perspective of conventional truths, characteristics appear. And so this is getting at how does the mind, what aspect of the mind engages with those conventionally existing characteristics. Now, as soon as we ask an ultimate truth question, like that goddess did, right? I've looked for 12 years and haven't found a truly existent or ultimately existent. Now you're asking an ultimate truth question. And from an ultimate truth perspective, there are no intrinsically existing characteristics, according to Madhyamaka perspective. So we have to differentiate ultimate truths and conventional truths. But even, and according to one more point, last point I'll make in response to your question is, Yongdzin Yeshe Gyaltsen would say, in either case, though, it's engaged with by the mind. And even when the mind is engaging ultimate truth, it's going to have mental factors that help engage the ultimate truth. For example, attention. Otherwise you would get distracted and you would forget what if you weren't paying attention, then you would see ultimate truth and you would immediately get distracted from it, or mindfulness that stays with the ultimate truth, for example. So he would say, even when the mind is engaging ultimate truth, the mind has mental factors that engage with it. For example, being mindful of it is one example. But so at this point about characteristics, one has to differentiate the ultimate truth and conventional truth is my main point. Does that make sense though, or do you have more? Is there more questions about it?
No, it makes sense.
Okay. Other questions before we go on? So now just clarifying what sorry, go ahead.
Lauren, could you repeat who had made the sexist comment or
it was Shariputra.
Oh, and the goddess?
And the goddess, I don't remember, I don't know, I'd have to look in the sutra if she has a specific name or if it's just, she's a goddess who lived, actually I'll share the rest of the story. It's a very funny passage in the Vilamakirti Sutra. I don't remember if she has a Sanskrit name right now. But she, after she says, I've looked for 12 years and haven't found an ultimate existence, she then magically snaps her fingers or something. I can't remember exactly how she does it, but she does some magic and Shariputra suddenly is has her form and she has his form. And then she says something, and then she says to him, well, basically like, why are you female? And, kind of starts asking him questions about, and of course Shariputra gets quite uncomfortable, and then she switches them back, and so she does this whole kind of teaching for Shariputra, basically, at that point. It's a wonderful passage in the sutra. There are a couple of translations of that sutra, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it gives her, I can't remember. I'll look it up and I can tell you next time.
Thank you. Vimalakirti Sutra, you said.
Yeah, it's the Vimalakirti Nudesha Sutra. Yeah, Bob Thurman has the first translation of it, and then somebody else translated it later. I can't remember who, but I have Bob Thurman's translation here. So.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful text. Yep. Lynn.
I remember one thing you said when we started this unit, and you said what we did before was more epistemological, thinking about how we know things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my reductionist definition. And this was more psychological. And can you just explain what you meant about that? That would help me sort of figure out what we're doing here.
Yeah, sure. And I want to say a couple of things. One is like, you'll see actually, I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday actually, that from my perspective, actually, these two go together well, because actually you can't, in one way, from one perspective, it's how do you do psychology if you don't think about how we know what we know? So in one sense, they go together, but, and you'll see that there are times where I'll refer back to what we were studying before in order to explain certain questions, and Yeshe Gelsen will refer back to the topics we've already covered in order to explain what he's getting at here. So in some ways, they're very related. But I guess what I would say is this, is like, the difference in a way is like, here, a lot of what Yeshe Gelsen is going to be doing is, I'm going to jump ahead just slightly here, is like, and not all the text, but quite a bit of this text is describing things like, what does it mean? What is hatred? What is embarrassment? What is love? What is anger? What is mindfulness? Actually, what is mindfulness? So things like that. So it's more like describing. Actually, I'm going to use an analogy for a second, like that I think we'll get at it better, maybe. And I said that it's like a field guide, this text, to your mind, right? So one analogy I would give is like, oh, it's funny. Like yesterday, or you better, Shayla, my partner, she does like bluebird monitoring for the naturalists. And so she was telling me yesterday she saw like a butterfly in a field of flowers that she had never seen before. So she was like staring at it very carefully. She should go back to the car and compare it to her field guide. She had a field guide about butterflies. She has all these field guides because she loves things like that. And so she was counting the spots on the butterfly so she'd go back and figure out what kind of butterfly it was. In a way, this text, right, Mind and Mental Factors, is a bit like that. So in other words, you look inside and you see what's my inner state, and then you might look in this text to go, what was that? Was I just feeling animosity, or was it, what there are different translations of the terms here, but my point is like, this is getting at like, in your actual experience of, here's an example. I've opened the text to a random page. Non-conscientiousness, right? So this text describes what is the state of non-conscientiousness. So you might study this text and then in a certain moment go, wow, was that non-conscientiousness? You would look at your own experience, like she was looking at the butterfly, and then you might go back to the text and go, I think now experientially, I know what non-conscientiousness is. I saw it. And there are people like in bird watchers, right, where they check off, I've seen this bird, I've seen that bird. If you study this text, you might go inside your own mind, start watching yourself and say, can I find each of these different mental factors? Whereas what we did before, in a way, would be more like a class on, if you were going to do, how do you differentiate, like this text isn't getting into the details of, well, let's say this right, like using my analogy earlier, right? a field guide doesn't, what it doesn't have is, well, why do we create phyla? And if we're going to understand nature, why, what are the main categories? There's plant, whatever it used to be, right? What kind of kingdoms and phyla, what kind of categories are there, and how do we differentiate them, and why do we differentiate them in that way? That's really important to know, and that's not separate from a field guide. But do you see the difference in a way? Like the field guide is like, what do you, to look at your own mind in a given moment and then say, wow, what was that? What's going on? And if it's a negative one, what's the antidote to it? If it's a positive one, how do I keep cultivating it? If it's a neutral one, what's its function, and how do I work with it to help myself? So this is more like that. Whereas what we were studying before is more like, almost like from a stepping back and looking at, well, how do we understand, how we progress through different things, different ways of knowing, and how do we sort of use analysis to change our ways of knowing. And again, there's overlap, right? We're going to get into like direct perceivers again here, which we're part of that class. But that class was getting at, what's, in general, what's the sort of definition of a direct perceiver. Here we're going to get at, the main focus is when you're having a direct perceiver, what are the mental factors that are engaging with that in an experiential way? So the previous one was like, almost like stepping back and saying, what is a direct perception? What's the definition of it? What's the difference between that and this other way of knowing, conceptual knowledge, right? This is not looking, this is the same territory, but now we're looking at, wow, when you're having a conceptual knower, are you distracted or are you focused? Are you they're all different. Are you being mindful of it or not mindful of it, is my example, or what's your intention as you're looking at that? So this one is getting at almost more like, in the moment, what are the different qualities of your mind that are engaging with that object? Whereas the previous one was getting at, what are the broad definitions of those and how do they function? And what are the differences between them? Does that make sense, the difference a little bit? So I think it's a reasonable analogy. That the other one was more like an introduction to how do we know what we know. This one's more like a field guide to the mind, like what's going on in your mind and what are the different factors that your mind is engaged with, or aspects of your mind that are engaging, and how do you understand those different aspects? And to give a different analogy, not like I did the one of nature, but another way of getting at it is like, you could say the previous one was like, if you were thinking of cars for a second, right? The previous one would be like, if you were studying like how, the fundamentals of how cars work, like they have an engine, and or is it an electric engine or is it a gas engine, and what are the, like, it would be almost like that. Whereas this is like, how do you fix your car? I'll be giving an analogy for a second. What are the parts of the car? And how do you, and if one of them is not working well, how do you fix it? Or how do you, whatever. Like, so they're not contradictory, but they're two different types of, I used nature, I used car. I was using metaphors for a second, but, it'd be like that. So, this one will be like, what are the parts? And how do you, if your car isn't working properly, how do you fix it? And, the other would be more about like, what are the nature of cars and how are they, what's the theory of combustion engines? Those aren't two contradictory things, right? But and one helps the other, but they're two different ways of engaging with the material, you could say. That's how I would, does that, I don't know if that clarifies it all, but. So this is really getting at, what are the parts? I like that analogy of the car part thing, just because this is getting at what are the parts, right? That's what aspects we're calling it, right? Mental factors and so on. It's like, what are the aspects or the parts of the mind so that you can work with them? Yeah, but they're not contradictory. They really go together. And one other point I'll make, just because it's relevant, is also that previous material mainly comes from the pramana, right? That, which is epistemology, I would call it, or and also logic and logic and epistemology teachings. Whereas this material mainly comes from the Abhidharma, and actually that's relevant in a way, because the pramana, the previous set of classes came from pramana, which are about logic and how do we know what we know. But these come from Abhidharma. He already quoted Vasubandhu's Abhidharma. And what is Abhidharma in Buddhism? To a large extent, there are many different Abhidharma texts, but Abhidharma's specialty is categorizing, if that makes sense. What the Abhidharma, Abhidharma is one of the three baskets of scriptures. There are the Sutras, the Vinaya, and the Abhidharma. These are called the three baskets. And the Abhidharma is a humongous basket of different texts. But in a way, the Abhidharma's specialty is category, and it's like, that's why I'm also using this analogy of a field guide. Field guides categorize, and what the Abhidharma does is it categorizes not just mind, it categorizes all different things, so if you study Abhidharma, you're studying like, what are the kinds of karmas? What are the aspects of mind? What are the aspects of the physical world? That's what Abhidharma does to a large extent. And it uses that to teach selflessness also. So it's not that it contradicts selflessness, but it's sort of looking at the various categories of things that exist to increase our understanding and our wisdom. And this is really an extraction of that, and Yeshe Gelson is saying the mind is the most important thing. So let me extract from the Abhidharma mainly the material that you need to know to understand the mind. So it's like, so it's the categories of mind, or the aspects of mind that are most important for practice. So, other questions? It's good. I'll go a little further, but feel free to keep interrupting. It's good to have questions. Good thing. So going back to what he says, like, there's another analogy that's sometimes given, which I'll say now. So here, maybe I'll say here what he says. So one thing he's saying is the main mind is distinguished by the mere observation of the object itself, and does not need to be posited in terms of other attributes. So one point is like that he's getting at is, first of all, like and I'm going to read a quote from Geshe Rabten related to this. He calls that the main mind the primary cognition, just different translation. He says, a primary cognition established by means of its apprehension of the fundamental presence of the object, a mere consciousness of the data presented to it. So the main mind, or the primary consciousness, whatever we want to translate that as, the basic mind, as he puts it, right, is knows the fundamental, apprehends the fundamental presence of an object, or apprehends, is a mere consciousness of data presented to it. So there's something very basic and simple about the main mind, right? The main mind sees blue, or sees green, or hears sound, or feels pressure on the skin or something like that, right? That's the main mind. And then the mental factors, as it says in our text, take the observation of that very object as its basis and engage the object by means of isolates and other attributes, such as the outcome of its function. And in the text here, looking back in that same paragraph under the bullet points, he gives examples, right? He says, so the main mind, we're saying, like, perceives the mere data, right, of perception. And then he gives an example. He says one aspect of a mental factor is moving the mind towards that. Another is non-forgetfulness. He gives two different examples in that paragraph. Those are mental factors, right? So in other words, the non-forgetfulness of whatever the main mind is perceiving is a mental factor. It's part of how the mind is engaging, or moving the mind towards that object, right, is a mental factor. It's something beyond the mere cognition of the presence of the object, right? And also feeling, right? Like, there is another one of the omnipresent mental factors. It's always there, is feeling, right? But that's a mental factor, right? So like the mere presence of the object, let's say blue, right? So an eye consciousness perceiving blue, the eye consciousness that just merely perceives blue is the main mind. But if you, there could be a feeling. If you like blue, you might have some kind of pleasant feeling. If you hate blue, if you tend to dislike blue, you might have some kind of unpleasant feeling, right? If you don't care about blue, you'll have a neutral feeling, whatever. That's a mental factor that's perceiving an aspect from your perspective. Blue's pleasant, blue's unpleasant, whatever that might be for you, right? That would be an example of a mental factor. So the main mind perceives the mere presence of the object, and the mental factor perceives is how you engage with the object and perceives various, as he's saying here, aspects of the object, or isolates about that object. And it says here, it engages the object by means of isolates, right? So, and we said what isolate, right? I said there's the isolate. I just said that a few minutes ago. Their isolates are conceptually differentiable aspects of a thing. Right? We can get into more about what isolates are later, but I don't think it won't help. Here, I think it'll be confusing. Okay, I'll go to the next step here because it's the same thing. Quam, are a mind and its mental factors one entity or different entities? And then he again quotes the Abhidharma, the treasury of knowledge, which says, a mind and its mental factors are definitely simultaneous. And then he explains, just as has been said above, the main mind and its mental factors arise together simultaneously. Not being different entities, they are the same entity. Moreover, the main mind and the mental factors in his retinue, are said to be of one entity and concomitant by way of 5 types of similarities. So I already said this, right? The mind and mental factors are of one entity, but I want to say more about that now because this is usually where this is said. There's various analogies that are given. The text here says retinue, right? In its retinue, and that's a common metaphor that's used among the Tibetans, and they'll sometimes use the example of like traditionally Tibetans will use the example of a king, where they'll say, a king always has a retinue around them. In the same way, and a king, in this metaphor, the king is the main mind, but the retinue would be the mental factors. And actually, and part of the reason I think they use that is like, a king or like a president or somebody like that, right? When they travel, they have a retinue. As long as somebody's in that role, they're going to always have a retinue around them. And it's a metaphor to get at, so the let's say president would be the main mind, and then there are certain people in their retinue who are always around, and there are others who come and go, right? Like, if they're on an international tour, they'll have certain foreign service people with them or something, whereas if they're on a domestic trip to Ohio, those people probably won't be there, but some other people will, maybe somebody from the department of, depending on what they're doing, right? They'll have people from whichever department with them. If they're going to see about energy, they'll have somebody from that department, and so on. So the point is like there are certain in this metaphor, there's the main mind is always there, right? That's the president. And then there are some parts of the retinue are always there, and other parts only come at certain times. That's one way of getting at this idea of retinue, right? That another metaphor that someone uses a hand, right? Is going to say that the hand and the fingers are not separate entities, but the fingers accompany, but the fingers are part of the hand and accompany the hand. So it's another metaphor. They're just trying to get at different metaphors to get at one entity, but you can, so actually my hand is not, my thumb is not a separate entity from my hand, right? But you can certainly conceptually isolate. It's an isolate, right? You can say, oh, that's the thumb versus the palm. You can differentiate them, but they're not separate entities, like the example I gave earlier of, a person and their attributes. So this is saying, the mind and the mental factors are of one entity, and it says here they are simultaneous, right? They arise together and they stop together. So you can't have, and part of, like I use the example of a feeling, right? So, you can't have a feeling about something without a mind perceiving that something, right? Whether it's directly perceiving it or remembering it. There has to be a mind engaging a thing in order to have a feeling about that thing. You can't pay attention to something if you're not perceiving it, right? So they go together. is one point. And they're simultaneous. And we're going to get more into that in a bit because it gives those 5. It says here there are 5 similarities or 5 similarities between minds and mental factors, which we'll get into in a minute. But it says, to explain this clearly, when the mindfulness of an object, for example, a form, is produced, the two, the mind and the mindfulness in its retinue, are similar in observing the object form. Nevertheless, they are posited separately. So he was getting at there, so he's saying they're one entity, right? But they're posited, they can be thought of separately. Posited means they can be thought of separately, right? They can be conceptually isolated separately. They can be talked about separately, right? And we do that, don't we? We say, are you being mindful today, right? And then we can say, are you aware of the color blue? Those are 2 separate questions, but they're not separate in entity, right? And it says the knower of the mere entity of an object form is called mind, right? So again, he's just saying it in different ways, hoping that, to help us get clear that the knower of the mere entity. Earlier I quoted Geshe Rabten. He said, the fundamental presence of an object, or the mere consciousness of the data of the object. Here Geshe Gelsen says, the mere entity of an object, form. So and he's giving an example of visual consciousness, right? So whereas when you see something, the mere awareness of the entity of that existence, the existence of a thing, of a visual object, that's the main mind. But from the point of view of function of acting not to forget, so in other words, when you think about what he's getting at is you can isolate then when mindfulness is non-forgetfulness, is the definition of mindfulness is something like something you've been aware of already, or not forgetting it. So staying mindful of it, right? The mindfulness in relation to that form is a mental factor. That's what he's getting at, right? And it exists as one entity with the main mind aware of that, but it's conceptually an aspect of that mind. It is not the case that they have separate entities like a vase, a pillar and a vase. That was the example I gave earlier. I said, that I used Lisa and Lynn, but a pillar and a vase is a traditional Tibetan thing, right? Whereas a pillar is part of a building and a vase is an object that you can bring into and out of the building. They're separate entities, right? So a pillar and a vase would be separate entities, right? Whereas a pillar, let's say, if you say, in Tibetan monasteries, they have these like red pillar, right? Pillars are often red with beautiful decorations, right? So if you were to say, right, a pillar and a vase are 2 entities. But if you say, the red pillar, right? The redness is not a separate entity from the pillar. It's an aspect of that pillar. And you can say it's a round pillar, or it's a square pillar, and so on. Those would be aspects. So here, the mind and mental factors are like the redness and the roundness of the pillar. They're not like the pillar versus the vase as 2 separate entities. These modes have been set forth in accordance with how it is taught in Gyaltsab Je's Essence of the Ocean of Knowledge, an explanation of the Compendium of Knowledge. And Gendon Drupa is the first Dalai Lama, his Ornament of Reasoning, the great treatise on valid cognition. Okay, so that there he's made it clear. I just pause. What has he said very clearly there? And this is what you should take away from this: is a main mind and its mental factors are of one entity, right? You can conceptually notice, and you're going to notice this in your own experience, right? Ultimately, right? When you look inside yourself, you're going to notice, okay, so when I'm perceiving something, there's a main mind and there are mental factors. They're of one entity, but I can notice them different. I can notice their different aspects, right? That's the point. And we're going to do that as we go along in practice. So that's why he's pointing this out, because later we're going to actually do that as we look at our own minds. Now, now he quotes Gendon Drupa. And actually, you're going to see what I was getting at earlier now, right? So Gendon Drupa is the first Dalai Lama, and he's going to quote and notice what just came above, right? And that definition I gave earlier, right? The primary consciousness or the main mind sees an object, right? That which sees an object or that which knows individually, that's from the Abhidharma. Now he's quoting Gendon Drupa, and what is he quoting? Ornament of Reasoning, the great treatise on pramana, on valid cognition. So what's the signal there? Remember I said the first definition he gave was for meditators? Now he's going to give a definition for pramana, right, which is for debaters, for logicians, for philosophers. So he's going to define main mind now differently for the purpose of debate or for the purpose of philosophy. And so what's the definition? The definition of a main mind is that which is concomitant by way of 5 similarities with the mental factors in its retinue. And then he says, what is the definition according to this approach, pramana approach, to mental factor? The definition of mental factor is that which is concomitant by way of 5 similarities with its main mind. Right. So and we're going to get into what are the 5 similarities, but on the one hand, he's making an interesting point here, isn't he? That the mind and the mental factors always go together, right? Is implicit in that in this definition. Do you feel? I just want to make sure you get it, though, right? The earlier definition. Do you feel how it's for practice, right? In other words, you're looking at what do you know, right? Well, if you're sitting there meditating and sort of trying to, or if you're angry and you're trying to understand how your mind works, you're going to see, oh, I'm thinking of this person who annoyed me, and one of my mental factors is anger. That's how I'm knowing them, right? I'm knowing them by way of anger, for example, right? Here, he's getting at a definition, and Lynn, I think this is hinting at what you were asking about earlier, right? It's a prominent definition. You see what I'm getting at? So it's more like he's not looking at it's not so much looking at how do you fix the car. He's looking at a broader question, right? That he's looking at the question of like by my analogy earlier of if Abhidharma if this text with the focus from Abhidharma is like the manual of how do you fix the car, this one's more like looking at what's the nature of a combustion engine, right? What is main mind? Main mind is that which is concomitant by way of 5 similarities with mental factors, right? What are mental? So he's getting it more like almost from a more broad perspective, or a more philosophical perspective, or a more epistemological perspective, right? What is main mind? Is that which is always accompanied by mental factors. What are mental factors? It's that which always is accompanied by main mind. You see the difference? Like, I just want to point, they're both correct definitions, but you can see how, I hope you can feel it, right? Like they have different purposes. One's, and again, like, I'm using my analogy of the car. If you want to fix a car, if your car is not working and you want to fix it, I'm no expert on that, but again, Mike would have to be the person, who would know, he knows about fixing things, but you don't need to know, like, I'm just differentiating, right? Like, if you're studying the history of combustion engines, you don't need to know how to fix a particular vehicle's car. And if you're fixing a particular vehicle's car, you don't necessarily have to know the whole history of combustion engines. But they're both connected and they're both useful. And sort of the theory. And if you want to design a new engine, you need to know how combustion engines work, right? But you don't need to know all of that if you want to fix one. My point is like, I'm just using a metaphor, right? The pramana is more like, you see the definition in pramana here? It's about how does this all work? How do they relate? The earlier definition from Treasury of Knowledge, from Abhidharma, is more about like, what's the experience? It's an experiential definition for meditators, for practice. Sujata. Yeah.
I'm struggling with so this is a little bit off point because I know you're trying to talk about these two different, I'm going back to the experiential.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so having trouble figuring out what the sort of primary, maybe I'm getting confused between primary consciousness and the primary object. So for example, when you're just thinking about the person who's the object of my anger, right, is the primary consciousness, and the anger is the mental factor. But I start to go into this place where I'm thinking that when is the anger like the primary thing I'm focusing on? Like where does it? So if I'm thinking about a person that I'm angry at, right? Just thinking about the person, not the anger or whatever, just the person. And then anger that arises that I feel about that person is the mental factor. But then if I switch to thinking about the anger, then the anger seems to become, and I'm not thinking about the person anymore, I'm thinking about the anger. Then does that become the primary consciousness? The minute I start thinking about the factors seem to become the new central thing I am thinking about. Does this make sense?
So you're saying, like, I just want to make sure I get it. Like, are you saying, like, because I want to differentiate two different things, like, and see if I get it in a way. Is like, let's say somebody who doesn't practice Buddhism and who isn't doing Dharma practice, right? So in other words, an average, most people, let's say, like if they get angry at a family member, let's say, right, then they're angry at that family member, and they're thinking like, I'm not, there are many mental factors. Anger is only one of the mental factors, right? But they may say, right, like, so they're thinking this person's a jerk and they did this and they're like that and they're always whatever, so, and they're thinking of their face and they're feeling annoyed at their face and they're feeling whatever, and all these different things, right? So in that case, the main mind is continuing to focus on the person. Anger continues to be one of the mental factors, and there are other mental factors. And then that would be in a sense, that's simple, right? It's not, and it's a non-virtuous state, and obviously. What you're getting, I think, is something different, which is because you practice Dharma, right? So you might be angry at somebody, and then you switch from thinking of where the main mind was focused on the person, but now you're looking at the anger, right? And then your main mind is engaging with anger, and then you might be thinking, like if you're practicing Dharma, you might be thinking, oh wow, like, this is anger, and anger is a destructive thing, and it may harm myself or the other people, and they're all, you go through like Shantideva, right, the definition, what's the disadvantages of anger and the advantages of patience and so on. Yeah, so at that point, for the person who's practicing Dharma, for sure, then we could say then the main mind now is focused where its focus is, let's say, anger in that case. And then you're, using various mental factors to engage with, to engage about the anger and so on. So then, and there would come a point actually where, it's an interesting question, right? Like, at what point are you still angry as you're engaging about anger? And then there comes a point where you're more like engaging with them, because there's two different things, aren't there? One is you could be engaging with like actually, if I'm just pausing it to give a more nuanced concept, my own reflection, I guess, on your question. Because at one point, a person might actually, it's interesting, isn't it? Like if you really get into the main mind question, again, for the person who's just doing what the typical thing, then they're just, the main mind would continue to be focused on the person who they're angry at. But if you're a Dharma practitioner, it's actually much more complicated, isn't it? Because you might be focused on the person, then you might switch and focus, for example, on where the main mind is noticing physiological sensations, let's say. Oh, wow, my heart rate, for a moment, you're noticing my heart rate's like this, or I'm feeling tension in my body, or I'm clenching my jaw. In that moment, the main mind is engaged about the body, then, right? Is engaged about a bodily sensation. And there would still be a mental factor of anger, because you're still feeling the anger. But there are other mental factors now that we will talk about that are starting to engage. And then if you start to engage with a theoretical understanding about anger, right, where you start thinking, oh, wait a second, I read Shantideva and I know this about anger. Now the mind is actually engaged with you could say a sound isolate. They call it a sound isolate and a meaning isolate. And there is a term and a term and a definition. Oh, the word anger, a word, right? The word anger, and then your understanding of what anger is. Then that's the object. For a moment, I'm just, I'm giving an example, right? So there could be many different objects that the main mind is engaging, and in that case, in my example I just gave, right, like a term and a definition. So at that point, like there could be a moment, right, where because you're practicing Buddhism, where you're thinking, oh, this is anger. I'm really mad at that person. I don't like them right now, and I want to harm them or something. That's anger, right? There, you're engaging with a correct conceptual understanding of what anger is. So there could be many different, and each time the main mind is engaged with a different, in any given moment, the main mind can engage with different objects. So at one point, it could be the main mind could be the object, the main mind could be the other person, another could be your own physical sensation, another could be, a correct conceptual understanding of something. Another moment, it could be an incorrect conceptual understanding. So, if you then thought something about the person that was wrong, let's say, and then, and back and forth. So, you could jump around. But in any given moment, there's one object, that of a certain main mind. And then there are mental factors involved in how the mind is engaging that object. Does that get it?
Perfectly. Thank you. That was super helpful.
Oh, good. Yep. Other comments or questions?
I just had, thanks. I just general question about in Buddhism. The general categories you mentioned, the pramana, which is kind of the philosophy and for debaters, and then the Abhidharma, which is the categories and I guess the kind of the psychology. And of course, there's like Vinayana, which is the ethics. But what are the general categories? Are there 3 or 4 general categories of study like this?
Oh yeah, well, it's funny. There are many different ways of categorizing Buddhism. As Buddhists are really good at lists, aren't we? So what I mentioned there, sometimes they talk about the 3 baskets. Well, you'll see that terms on them. So those are if you say 3 baskets, then it would be the Sutra basket, the Vinaya basket, and the Abhidharma basket. So that's one way of categorizing. Like the Buddha's teachings are into the 3 baskets, and when they categorize them that way, then they would all the other. You could say almost like all the other, and they say like and actually what they say is that the in that categorization is that the Vinaya they're related to the 3 higher trainings. So the Vinaya basket is connected to the higher training in ethics. The Sutra basket is connected to the higher training in concentration, and the Abhidharma basket is connected to the higher training in wisdom. That's one way they sometimes differentiate all the Buddha's teachings, but there are other there are other ways of categorizing the Buddha's teachings, because and actually, sometimes you'll notice if I've noticed this, that lamas are always good they would say none of them are. I've seen them say none of them are contradictory. In other words, so if you had another, so you might say, well, wait a second, but there are sutras and tantras, right? So where does tantras fit in? That's not listed in this. Then they would say, well, they would say, well, if the tantra, they might say that, well, the tantras are focused on meditative concentration, so they would come under the sutra basket. They would be in the sutra basket then, or something like that. So they would still, and you might say, well, wait a second, like the Majjhimaka, the Mula Majjhimaka Karika is not a sutra, it's not a Abhidharma, and it's not a Vinaya. But if you're thinking of it in terms of wisdom, then you would say, well, that's it's not an Abhidharma text, but it's a text on wisdom. So there's always a way. I guess my point is that you could, and then like in the monasteries when they're studying, then they have 5 main topics, right? And so it's interesting because their 5 main topics are those 3, right? Because they study Vinaya, Abhidharma, Pramana, but then they also study Majjhimaka, and they study correction of wisdom. The Abhidharma, which is based on the Abhisamaya Alamkara. So that's another way, and then so that'll be another way of differentiating those studies. But again, what they would say is it's not contradictory. It's just different categories of scripture, different categories. So there are different ways to categorize those. Yeah.
Thanks.
Other question?
Yeah.
Oh, Wilhelmine.
Will we also talk about when there is anger about something and you can't completely understand it all, but you go in stages. the first time you come to a certain conclusion that you can go this far with the other person, and then the next time you have thought about it more, and then you can start to find a practical solution, and then you find another stage that it gets really down to where it's all about what needs to be done in order to, without getting angry, but just being practical of how can we solve this. But it sort of goes in stages because your mind is not immediately ready to understand all the consequences from what is going on. Will we go a little bit through that as well, or the developing mind or something?
Yeah, and I think when we get to when we get to, like, for example, a definition of anger, I think we can really look at that very carefully. Then, yeah, I think you're exactly right. That, and I think when we get to the definition of anger, it would be a great to, like, or the other ones too. Desire or craving, each of them. That's exactly the kind of question we want to ask then, right? Is like, oh wait, is this anger? What's the part? What exactly what you're getting at, right? There is, because even as you said it, right, there comes a point where it's like the person can find a solution without anger. So that would mean we'll get into that then, right? Because you could still feel, because, like, I think sometimes people get confused until we know these teachings to some extent, that so say it right. Recently Ken Rinpoche was making this point, right? Like, if something painful happens, right, or something upsetting to our mind, what you're getting at is correct, right? In other words, I think it's implying something, which is that's not anger, right? That's a result of past karma, right? That we have some kind of painful experience or difficult experience. That's not anger. And what we'll get at is exactly what you're saying, which is when we come to the section on anger, you can look at that. What's the difference? People sometimes think, oh, this happened and then I'm angry. But they don't differentiate. No, it's actually it's much more complicated than that, right? You have a negative experience that's a result of past karma. And even if you become patient, it doesn't get rid of that, right? That's what you're saying, well, I think, Wilhelmina.
Right. And you also have to know the other person's mind, how they react to what you are proposing. So you have to know their circumstances to know more how you can maybe come to a solution. And then you can ask, can we come together with somebody who can moderate that or something?
So you're going to get the practical ways of dealing with situations. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and those are reasonable. And I think what I'll be curious about as we go along is, like, I think you'll have input or thoughts as we go along with some of the other mental factors. Which ones would you use to, because which mental factor? I'll be curious if you have input later when we get to that section. Which mental factors would you use at that time to come up with a practical solution?
Yeah,
and that's right. Yeah, so you would look at what mental factors can you use internally to start moving it away from anger towards solutions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, that's good. I think it's time. So I'll cover at least the first list, maybe. So here next, he said. So you remember we just said there are 5 similarities, right, between the minds and the mental factors. And so this is kind of interesting. He says, regarding the modes of the 5 similarities, there are 2 explanations. One is from the Treasury of Knowledge, which is a Vaibhashika. These are different tenet systems, right? And remember, I just said a few minutes ago, or at the beginning of this class, that Yeshe Gyaltsen's text is not coming from he's not limiting himself to one tenet system, right? He's trying to get at common elements for everybody to practice, any Buddhist to practice. So now he's going to get both, right? So he's saying he's being comprehensive in a way, right? So he's saying, in terms of what are the 5 similarities, right, between minds and mental factors, he says, actually, there are 2 different explanations of them. One comes from the Treasury of Knowledge, which I believe is was written by Vasubandhu, I think, and is one of the Hinayana tenet systems. It's from a Hinayana perspective. And he says there's another explanation of the 5, which comes from a Mahayana perspective, and it comes from a Sangha, who's the brother of Vasubandhu. And that's in the Compendium of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Samyukaya. Those are 2 important Abhidharma texts in Tibet, the Abhidharma Kosha and the Abhidharma Samyukaya. And one way I'm just noting for people who are curious, like the one of the differences between them is that the Abhidharma Kosha is written from a Hinayana tenet system perspective, whereas the Abhidharma Samyukaya by Asanga is written from a Mahayana tenet perspective. They're, again, it's not that they're against each other, they're just different presentations. And you'll see these two lists of 5 concomitant factors are similar but slightly different, and they get at different things that are interesting. But okay, so the 5 things, I remember what we're getting at here though, what are the 5 similarities or samenesses or something between minds and mental factors? And this is, I just want to point out also, all of this is just, is really explaining what are these things, what is mind and mental factors, so then we can get into the details. But you have to understand what is a mental factor before you can get into details of specific mental factors. So that's why he's covering this. I just want to remind people. Okay, so the 5, and I'm just going to, he lists them and then he gives a definition. So I'm not going to read the list because we'll just go through the definition. It covers the same thing. So there's 1, similar support, then 1 is going to be support. So we'll go, the individual meanings are as follows. So first we'll do the similar support. Since a mental factor is also supported by the sense power upon which the mind is supported, their supports are similar. So what does that mean? What he's getting at is, and this is, Lynn, remember earlier you asked about, what's the again, this is practical, but in order to understand this, it helps if you've already studied. This is why that we already studied the pramana. The pramana part of the came first. It would be really hard to understand this if you hadn't understood that, if you hadn't studied that previously. Because what he's getting at support means, remember we covered this, is for each main mind, there's we called it an uncommon empowering condition. And the uncommon empowering conditions were the sense faculties or the mental faculty, right? And so where it says support, what it's getting at is that it's supported by a sense power upon which that mind is supported. So what it's getting at is this, is if it's an I consciousness or the main mind is visual, right? Then it's the unique empowering condition of that mind is the visual sense faculty, right? And because you can't have a visual mind, a visual awareness without a visual organ and a visual sense, right? The visual sense power. And so what it's getting at is that, so in the example I gave earlier, if you're seeing blue, right, then the unique empowering condition is in that case would be the visual sense faculty, right? And that empowers both the main mind and the mental factors, right? And so, if you see blue and you like and you feel the feeling is pleasant, you like blue, then they have the same support, meaning they're both supported by the visual, eye sense power, right? And both the main mind that's aware of the general presence of blue and the feeling, in this case, pleasant, because you like blue, in that case, in my example, have the same support. That's the meaning of same support. The second one is they have the same object of observation, right? And that means they're both seeing blue in my example, right? They're both seeing the same, so there is the mental faculty that likes blue is in relation to the same object of observation as the main mind, which is perceiving the mere presence of blue, right? So they have the same support, meaning the same kind of faculty or sense faculty or sense power. And they also have the same object of observation, the mind and the mental factors. Then in this list, the third one would be, I'll read what it says. Since the mind, it's the same aspect, is what it says. And so it says, since when the mind is generated having an aspect, for instance, blue, this is my example, its mental factor is also generated in that aspect. And sometimes aspect, another translation is mode of apprehension, or Ladi Rinpoche, how it's being perceived, is the way he put that. So it's like they have the same, so again, they have the same support. You get the sense now of the difference. They have the same support, they have the same object, and they have the same way of being perceived or the same aspect. Or the same mode of apprehension. They always mean the same thing. Then the fourth one, since a mind and a mental factor are simultaneous, in regard to the three, production, abiding, and cessation, their times are the same. Similar means the same in this context. So that means that they're of one entity, right? So if two things are of one entity, they arise simultaneously, they abide simultaneously, and they cease simultaneously. Yeah, so that's that. So they exist in the same. They exist for the same amount of time, and in the same time, and like that. One other point that's an implication of that I'll just mention, just for thinking, is therefore a mind and a mental factor can't be causes of each other, right? A cause and an effect have to be temporally different, right? A cause has to come before an effect has to become after a cause. So a mind and its own mental factor can't cause each other, right? Because they're simultaneous. They have to be caused by a previous moment of some, of mind. And the last one says the same similar substance, same substance. And what it says here is, just as minds of a similar type are distinct substances, likewise mental factors such as feelings of a similar type are also distinct substances. Therefore, their substances are similar. That one's hard to understand, I think, if you just read that. It's like looking at God. The words were alone didn't, for me, induce ascertainment. But I checked, and there are two different traditions, or something at least, of what that one means. So I'll tell you both, and you can pick which one you like better for what that means. I guess in the monasteries, there are two different ways to interpret that. One, which is Geshe Rabten, his book explains that one this way. He says, when he says similar substances, he says what that's getting at is that, and this is again from Lynn's question. You can, earlier I said like the idea that of unique empowering condition. You have to, if you hadn't studied pramana, you wouldn't know what that is, right? But so we studied enough pramana to know what that is. Here also, this is going to come from the pramana part. So a similar substance would mean if the primary mind is a mistaken consciousness, then the mental factors are going to be mistaken. If the primary mind is a perception, then the mental factor can't be conceptual, right? If the primary mind is conceptual, then the mental factors can't be direct perception. So in other words, they're the same type of knower, is one way of putting it, right? That they're similar substance. One way of interpreting similar substance is that they're the same type of knower. So and one more example, if the primary mind is an inferential cognition, then the mental factor can't be a direct perceiver because they're the same type of mind, if that makes sense. They're the same type of knower. That's one way of understanding this fifth point. Another way, which was Lottie Rinpoche's commentary on this one, was that, I'll read what he said. Only a single entity of feeling, for example, arises an accompanier of a single entity of an I perceiver. Therefore, they are of one substantial entity. So his way of interpreting this thing of one substance means that you can't, in the same instant, have two different feelings about the same object. So that in that instant of perceiving blue, it's either pleasant or it's unpleasant. It's not both at the same instant. It can change over time but that's a different moment of and a different perceiver, and therefore can have a different feeling. So they gave different interpretations. I personally, I like Geshe Rabten's definition. I think it's interesting to think about that they're the same type of knower, say. But you can, either is correct as far as my understanding goes on that. Sujata.
I'm really confused about the simultaneous nature. When I think about an object of my anger, and I'm thinking particularly about like the meditations we do where we break down, like, that there's a pause, I can hear even like in my work, we talk about the possibility to pause between, your perception of something and the emotional response that arises. So thinking back to the example of the object of my anger being a person and the anger actually arising, those two things don't feel simultaneous to me. And so that's, I think the times are similar pieces, really. I'm confused. Yeah.
say just a little more. I want to make sure I get like, so they don't feel simultaneous. You mean be like, I guess I want to make sure if I understand right. Like, are you saying like, for example, I think you're saying something more subtle than this. So I'll just ask like, because one way of getting it, like, how to say there, like, I mean, certainly, like, let's say I could have a friend who one moment I see them and I'm quite fond of them. Another moment I'm distracted and I don't barely notice, I'm distracted by something else, but they pass by. And then in a different moment, I might be angry at them. Mm-hmm. And then again, I may like them. So, like, I mean, that happens. It's one of the meditations on equanimity, right? We notice that. That's not, I think you're getting at something subtler than that, right? So
way more subtle.
Sure I get it.
Yeah,
way more describe subtle. The subtle part you're getting at.
So let's say I'm really angry at you. I see you, right? And then you're walking down the street and I see you. And first there's just like the cognition of your form, right? That to my mind is the main mind, right? And then there's a gap between the perception of you and the arising of the anger, which I'm thinking of as the mental factor, the anger being the mental factor, and that they're not totally like, there's like it might be hard to perceive that gap, but it's there, right? Everything isn't happening simultaneously in that emotional reaction, which might be like maybe the emotional, like using that the person that you're angry at as the object of my anger, and then the anger itself is the mental factor. It is more like, rather than like seeing you in a red shirt, there's like more of a simultaneousness of the perception of red. Versus like the emotional response. Or maybe there's not, maybe there's a gap there too. I just haven't been able to ascertain it. But in my emotional states towards people, I've been able to create a little bit of space between, like if I'm really looking at it, I can see that there's a gap.
I think I'll just share I'm going to share my own reflection on what you're getting at, if that's okay. And then we'll keep going, because I think actually what you're getting at might be quite interesting to think about. It might be part of why I'm going to share my own reflection, and it might be, well, if you think about this enough, if we think about this enough, we might start to imagine why Ling Rinpoche carried this text around for decades and decades. Because it's an interesting question, right? Because I think you're getting at something very subtle, which I think is worth contemplating. And so what I want to say is, like, what you would actually have to contemplate then, right, if you're using these definitions, which are, from the actual Buddhist sources, right? You'd have to get it, and it's really interesting because it's getting at mind, right? Like, so you'd actually have to pause and notice, okay, so in one moment, right, like, one thing we're getting at, I guess I'm going to pause for, okay, say it this way. What this is getting at is that this idea of time, right? So arising, abiding, and ceasing. Right? How long do those last? Right? Is one interesting question, right? And what they're getting at there actually is quite intriguing, I think, because let's use your example, right? So you're walking down a road or a hallway or whatever, and you see, and the main mind has a perception of person there, right? The mere entity of person, right? And what's intriguing is, I'm going to give an example. I'm going to make something. It'll be different for different people in different moments, but let's say the initial feeling, right? There are three types of feeling: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Right? And let's say, so I'm giving an example, right? So I'm walking, down a road, and the main mind sees the entity of just person. And let's assume I have a neutral feeling at first, right? Like, And whatever, and we can go through other mental factors, but I'll just leave it at that one, the neutral feeling, right? And that neutral feeling is like the neutral feeling combined with that perception of person arises, abides for however long, a moment, a few moments, and then something happens, right? And what this would be getting at is what happens next is another moment, isn't it? It would be like, so then, and let's say it's anger, right? Then there's still a main mind, but now it's, and what they're getting at in a way, which I think is intriguing to think about, is that's a different main mind then. Because it's perceiving, in a way, a different object. Even though it's, we could say it's the same person in a sense, but the first one is a neutral object. The second one is an unpleasant, or the feeling would be an unpleasant, right? And let's assume if it's very quick that it's associated with anger already. What this would be getting at is that's a whole different, and one thing that's kind of intriguing is like each of those minds has a different intention. Then intention is an omnipresent mental factor, right? So actually, like it's not only the anger that would be different, the intention would be different. And the way, and the not only the time, but going back, right? Like, what was that? I learned remember where it said also the aspect, right? Meaning the mode of apprehension, how it's perceived, that would be different, right? Like, so actually all of these, or yeah, not all of them, because it could still be the visual sense power as the unique empowering condition. But numerous of the mental, and my point would be that numerous mental factors would be different in that next moment, right? And so that would be a different, we'll call it like a different main mind and a different active perception. And then that might last for however long, and then the next one would come, and actually I'm going to give an example. I'll just keep going for a second, right? Like, it's quite interesting, is it? Like, I'm going to give I'm just going to give my own fictional example, right? So I'm walking down the street and I see the person, and I have a neutral, I perceive the mirror entity of person. I have a neutral feeling. My intention is just to keep walking or something. I have no intention regarding that person in that moment. And I'm not, there's no anger, whatever. Then let's say in the next moment, right? There's a moment of perceiving person. There's an aversive feeling. There's a mental, which is one mental factor. There's a feeling of anger, right? And which includes a wish to harm them and so on, and many other things. And there'll be other mental factors. I want to give an example. Then let's say right next to me, a horn honked loudly, right? Now it's an ear consciousness, right? So it's an auditory consciousness. The unique empowering condition is the ear sense power. And one thing that's quite interesting is, like, let's say I don't like loud horns, which I don't, which many people don't, right? Like, the previous moment of, so, and then it might make it more likely actually that you would feel anger at the horn, right? And so the intention would still be negative, then, right? That you would have actually there would be an aspect of the mind directing your mind towards, like, actually, right, as soon as you hear a loud horn, if you were agitated because you just saw somebody you're angry at, and then right next to you somebody really suddenly leaned on their horn, that's the word I'm looking for, right? Like, your mind would, for an instant, your mind would move towards, right? Literally the person, literally within an instant, right, the person starts to turn, and you might feel anger at the horn, right? And some negative intention towards the horn. And then that's a different object, a different moment of consciousness, right? And then if you're already angry and now your anger is lower, and then you look back at the person, and that's a separate, now it's a whole separate moment of, so we would often think of it as if, oh, I saw so-and-so on 3rd Avenue, and as if that were all one moment. But what I'm using is actually and then, probably there would be even more intense anger at that moment, right? Like then you see the person, and immediately now there's anger that's full blown at that person, and there's a negative intention. So it's negative, and each, and one other point I want to make is that each of those moments is producing a separate karma, right? Because the karma is intention, right? So the moment where you had the neutral, just seeing the mere entity of the person without any anger and without any negative intention, it was a neutral karma, let's assume. Now, as soon as you get angry at the person, it's a negative intention. Then the anger at the horn, then the anger back at the person. And then like somebody might, whatever, and then you might smell something from the restaurant on your left, right? And whatever, and that's a separate moment that has its own mental factors, right? And that's unique empowering condition is an olfactory empowering, and then you look back at the person again. So my point is like those are each separate, does that make sense? Those are each separate moments that have their own 5 concomitant mental factors.
It's very, very helpful. I think where I get confused, and I mean, maybe this is opening way too large of a rabbit hole right at the end of class, but at some point maybe to touch on the relationship of this understanding of sort of new mind and new mental factors, that there's this continuum where that's happening, boom, 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 right? And how that relates to, going through the skandhas in meditation, because I think of it like when I'm practicing and I'm thinking about like a sensory experience, right? Going from like Vedana to discrimination, like it feels like it's one mind switching, and that's what moves us into, having formations and volitions and, ending up with the karmas. Like it's a single, it feels singular. And so that feels at odds, or even with like, the 12 links, it feels like it's a chain reaction occurring. And this, so maybe this is kind of having trouble holding all this in my brain, but there's a feeling of many, many chains all happening, right? So those chains are happening, but there's a new mind creating a new chain with every one of these moments. I think is what I'm trying to hold those two at the same time. Is my understanding of that correct? Do you know what I'm saying? Like when you think about like the 12 links, there's a mind and mental factors that's producing a string of things. And less than a millisecond later, there's a new mind with new mental factors creating a new string of things, and trying to hold those things. Whereas before, I think I was seeing things as I think that where I get confused is in that one string of things, there's a new mind and a new set of mental factors that's going off in another direction. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, I think no, and I think I'll share a reflection on that, which is like, and if you think of it from a positive karmic point of view, it's wonderful. But if you think of it from a negative karmic point of view for a second, in terms of the 12 links, for example, that you're getting at, then it's quite scary, isn't it? Like in other words, because that one moment of like where you saw the person, in my example, right? You saw the person you didn't like, and then you hear the horn, and there's a moment of clear, pure anger, like where maybe at the horn, in my example. That's a complete karma, right? Like there's an intent. I mean, there's an action, and it's a mental. What would it would be? It's not if you don't say anything or do something. If you don't say something or you don't throw something or whatever, but it's a complete mental action, right? If there's anger there, and then you turn back to the person and there's anger, at that person. Like each one is its own karma. And my point is just like we're creating a lot of karma. You're right, in terms of the 12 links. Each one is its own karmic has an intention, a negative, and each moment of negative intention, yeah, can be its own mental karmic action, can't it? You know, and that's different than if you actually create a verbal karma or a physical karma. Then that becomes an additional karma, kind of karmic thing. But and also one other point I'll make in relation to what Sujata said, also I think is a good point in a way, is, you know, by studying these things, right, like you know, we're getting at the mental, you know, 4 of the 5 aggregates are mental, right? 1 is physical form, right? But feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, well, compositional factors is mostly mental, not all, and consciousness. You know, so we're gonna, if you study this topic, then you can actually see what is, you know, what are those more clearly from an experiential perspective, as you were getting at, Sujata, like, you know, so you can actually see in the moment what is, what, you know, and how quickly feelings change, right? And how quickly intentions change and so on. Is interesting, I think. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Like just like in my example, like if you smelled food and you liked it, right? There might be a moment of craving. And then the next moment might be a moment of anger again. And they would have a different mental factor. You know, I'm just getting it right. Each one would have different mental factors and different. And the other thing that I'll point out though is like, and also you can use that to your advantage if you understand it, right? Like, because you could know better how to switch away from the more harmful mental factors, right? Towards anyway, so it's quite, you know, you start to get a sense of why all this is useful. That's my point, I guess. But I think, you know, we got to stop. So we'll stop there with those 5. The first set of 5. So we covered the first set of the 5 similarities, and the next set are quite similar but slightly different. So we'll cover those next time, and then. And I'll just say, so then, you know, and then we'll get into, you know, a little bit more about what is the primary consciousness. But then by next time, we'll start in on the actual mental factors. And there are these different lists. There are the omnipresent, on page 15, you can see it. So if you want to look ahead, you can. You don't have to, but so these lists, there are the 5 omnipresent mental factors. There are the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, 11 virtuous mental factors, 6 root afflictions, and 20 secondary mental afflictions, and 4 changeable mental factors. And I'll just say last thing for today is that the tradition says those aren't the only mental factors. You know, they say actually there are limitless different mental factors that could be explicated, but the Buddhist traditions and Abhidharma and so on list these ones because they're the 51 mental factors, because they're the most pertinent for practice, and that, you know, kind of if you understand them, then you can apply that to other mental factors. So, you know, I guess like they're considered enough to be able to then practice. If you can understand these, you can apply it to other mental factors and so on. So those will be the 51 we'll cover in terms of mental factors. And that will really be I think in my view, that's the heart of this. You know, so this is like introduction, so you understand what are minds and mental factors. And I think the questions have been great. And then we're going to get into what are, you know, these examples of mental factors. And that's like the field guide part. This is like the introduction. You know, the first part of a field guide is like explaining, and then you get into what are the, you know, the kinds of butterflies. And those are the equivalent to what are the mental factors. So okay, so we should stop there, and we can do our dedication. Oh, and by the way, I realized I should do the date, so I'll send. Well, Gabe will post it to the website, so I'll send Gabe soon some dates for July and August, because I should do this soon. Because obviously this class will go on into the fall, and probably, you know, I think my expectation is that this class will go until, you know, late fall, early winter, you know, before, but probably end before the end of the year is what I would expect. So, you know, because it's to cover the rest of the text. So let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel, Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, near the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Then we can do So I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you all the next class. And like I said, I'll send soon some other dates too.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Thanks, Lauren.